Hello and welcome to the Wednesday, May 8th edition of the Cluster API Office Hours, a sub-project of SIG Cluster Lifecycle. We have a relatively short agenda today, so if there's anything you want to cover, go ahead and add it into the agenda document. Let me go ahead and post that in the chat, and also go ahead and add yourself to the attending list. To start off with today, looks like it's you, Justin, with Cluster API accounts.
Yes, sorry, Pablo, I preempted you because I thought this should be fairly quick. It's basically a heads up that for Cluster API provider AWS testing, we've discovered that the janitor is, there are 20 Kappa Cluster API provider accounts, Cluster API provider AWS accounts. They were supposed to be in different AWS, there are 20 logins. They were supposed to be in sub-accounts, different accounts. So that they would see different objects. They are all in the same account. So basically, the janitor is going in and deleting things, which it shouldn't do because it assumed they were in different accounts, and it's deleting things way too fast. It's affecting COPS jobs, and it's also affecting any other AWS job. And it is also, in theory, affecting Kappa on Kappa. So like if you run two Kappa tests too quickly, that would interfere. We are likely, the short-term thing is that we will probably turn off the janitor, I guess, the sweeper, so that the BossCost janitor. So we have a fallback janitor that runs every 2 hours, and you will likely see resources that get cleaned up only after 2 hours if you leak them. So Jason, I think you had some ideas on the consequences, and then longer term, we will set up the Kappa accounts in separate, the Kappa logins in separate AWS accounts. But if you see, that's the proposed plan of action as of 20 minutes ago, and if you see weirdness, that could be, well, you should already be seeing weirdness, and if you see ongoing weirdness with resources continuing to exist when you weren't expecting to, that would be why.
So just to understand, the logins are all sharing the same account, which means they have the same resources within the same account, is that right?
Yeah, they all see the same instances, for example. So like GCP has projects, which are like separate domains, and the AWS has sub-accounts, so you can create multiple, naming is terrible. There must be a better name for this. But
is this worth disabling the periodics for? Because this is, I mean,
we could absolutely disable the periodics. I think it would suffice to just disable so BossCost is this thing which leases one of those accounts for the duration of a job, and after that job is returned, it goes and deletes everything in that account.
Right.
The problem is that account is everything in all of E to E. If we just turn off the cleanup there, anything that is leaked will basically still be there next time. We have so the secondary fallback will come in and get it in a couple of hours.
Mm-hmm.
It's a trade-off, right? We could just turn off the periodics, or we could turn off the thing.
Yeah, and then this is kind of a CNCF account management issue to be resolved.
Exactly. So today it is a CNCF. CNCF pays for it. That's not going to change, possibly with credits, but CNCF is responsible for the money side of things. They are also currently responsible for the administration of those logins. I think I got it right this time. We can take over the administration of the logins and generally of the accounts in Working Group Kate's infra. But to date, we have not had that, and it's had to go through the people who pay the bill.
Got it. Sounds good.
Did I keep it to 5 minutes?
Yeah, so I don't think we necessarily need to worry about disabling the jobs now, but potentially, because I don't think we're doing anything special for naming per run, we may end up getting conflicts if multiple jobs run at the same time, and we may end up with some weirdness there. So if we do see that, then we'll just go ahead and we can disable the periodics and the post-submits for the AWS provider. Until we can get the AWS account sorted out. But if we don't have to do that, then it would still be nice to have some type of signal.
You should be hitting it now. If you have two jobs that run now, they're in the same namespace. So if you run two at the same time.
Yeah, I just don't think we've hit that case yet.
Yeah.
Or it gets lost in the noise, right?
Are you talking with the CNCF? Like, have you communicated? I assume you've communicated.
So the action item that I will do from this is to send Ihor at the CNCF a description of exactly what we want.
Perfect.
That I got a tighter. I will find the correct names for accounts and logins. Try to make it ambiguous. Exactly. But Yes, I will send that email. I can CC anyone that's interested, but yeah.
Cool. Thanks.
Thank you, Justin. All right, and also somewhat related to you, Justin, as well, the next item is Vince with the release 0.1.1.
Yes, I'm trying to corner Justin so that now he's here. So like there have been a few issues, like because the 0.1.0 release of CAPI is like very old, and there's like a few bug fixes, especially because machine deployment is broken due to RBAC being out of date, and there have been also like a few other fixes. So is there any way that we could get a release out of this week?
Yes, how are you trying to contact me on a channel that I am not paying attention to? Or how are you trying to contact me?
Are you not paying attention to Cluster API channel?
Cluster API channel, I will look in that one. Okay, I'll look in Cluster API.
Sounds good. Thank you.
All right. Next item is Pablo with some questions about the data model discussion.
Hi, that's also be brief. I mean, it's more like a really common, something that arose yesterday in the cluster lifecycle meeting. That it's a concern. I also share that with Vince, and I think it's mostly that at some point in the conversation in the data model, and in the other side in the extension mechanisms, seems that there are kind of assumption that the webhook is the mechanisms, but actually there may also be a possibility of using a controller-based extension mechanisms. And actually, the point is that just to be careful. I mean, we all that probably there's a slight bias into thinking that as the extension mechanism is webhook, try to fit the data model to that use case. And even if it's probably, very likely, the webhook extension mechanism will be probably the one that will move forward because it's the one that has been more developed right now. Just to be careful not preventing that the extension mechanism based on controller can also be used. And actually, a mix of both, because in some cases, like the Bootstrap, for instance, or the machine, there are already some Bootstrap controllers that they will be interested to bring to the project. Red Hat had one, Gardener had one, and so it does only that we try to not fit the data model too much into the extension mechanism of webhook, even if we start working on that, give room to the controller base. That basically means that as much as possible, the provider-specific information should be external objects, reference from the cluster API objects, instead of trying to embed stuff from the provider. That's something that's already in the model, but just a minor wording. Just because some comments, it's like you read in between lines and say, it looks like you are assuming that it's the extension mechanism, but what if not? Is that only that?
I agree. In the data model discussion we just had, there was an example implementation, like diagram of the webhook model in that data model meeting. So I think it's more than implicit. It's pretty straightforward that that's the preferred mechanism at this point.
So even that, if that's true, that's what I just presented like a few minutes ago. I would say like presenting something and like making like the community aware of like what we're working on. It's not necessarily a bad thing. We're not trying to impose things on the community. As I mentioned, like everything is a work in progress right now, and we'll reconvene on the data model, extension mechanism, and all the other like proposals that are going to come in once we have a better idea on what we decided as a community. The purpose of it is mostly like to start feeling what the user experience and like an operator experience also like might be like if we go down that path, so that we can exhaust more kind of options, and like because we kind of already know like the workflow for controllers, and as I mentioned, like there shouldn't be like any stoppers for folks to have their own controllers or reconcilers. At the same time, there should also not be any stoppers for webhook implementation or similar implementations.
So, and I think something that's probably important to point out here is that everything that's being done within the work streams today is all leading towards proposals that will be brought up in this common meeting, will be sent out to the entire SIG cluster lifecycle group, and will have to gain consensus from the community before those proposals are actually merged. So none of the work being done is predeterminate of what's going to be accepted of, from the project as a whole at this point.
It's also important to note that everyone's going to make mistakes. This is V1 Alpha 2, and we're going to iterate. So if we make a mistake and we find a better way to approach things in a Alpha 3 or Beta 1, we can always make changes. But I don't think we should also, I think we should also be careful and mindful not to get into analysis paralysis either. Right? And this project, this sub-project in particular, has suffered from that from a community standpoint. Sometimes it's better to get something out there and iterate on it than it is to go into analysis paralysis for an extended period of time.
I agree, Tim. And again, I'm not saying that we should keep on discussing the extension mechanisms. I think that at this point it's pretty much clear that probably just because more people is interested in that, that's going to be probably, I just say probably, the reference implementation. My only point is that it make clear to all that this is not either or. At the end should only be one mechanism, that as much as possible we should support both of them. And even if the reference implementation is based on webhooks, probably some providers want to implement something in a different way. It's just, that's why I think that this is more like a data model related issue, because in the extension mechanism probably we can agree, or you say, on following the webhook, and that's fine. But the data model is not assuming that this is the only one. It's just that it's fine. The reference implementation for an extension is based on webhook, but the data model should be, as much as possible, support both of them. That's what I think is not as being paralyzed by analysis, just moving forward, but just keeping in mind that we should support both.
So I think the concrete request that Pablo is talking about is so for webhooks, the types are not necessarily CRDs, but for controllers, I think they must be CRDs. So if we want to support both, even if we do webhook as the reference implementation, perhaps we can consider defining the CRDs, but the webhook implementation obviously won't use them as such. But they'll exist, and they'll be available for controllers to consume.
So I don't know that it's true that webhooks can't use CRDs as their types, but it's an implementation detail in any case. I think that everyone's concerned about like biasing our future decisions. These are not, like, there's reason to believe that there's reason to believe we should be concerned about like assuming the goal, right? That said, we're also talking about introducing additional controllers. So like the control plane could be an additional controller. We're not saying that all extension mechanisms are webhooks. So I don't know. I feel like the whole discussion about webhooks is a little bit premature, and I'm not sure what concrete action we want to get out of it.
So one thing that potentially could be useful would be to remove any references in the data model that are in there right now about extension configuration and things that assume webhooks, or gRPC for that matter. We could put them in a separate spitballing section if we wanted to have it. But I will echo Jason and Vince and Tim. This is not meant to be prescriptive and set in stone. It was more just brainstorming what it would look like. So totally agree with everything that has been said so far. And yes, we're not trying to shove webhooks on everybody necessarily. That's really what the extension mechanism workstream is trying to determine.
I think the other concern that I had around that is not just the configuration stuff, which makes sense, but the idea that that would be the reference implementation. And if the point of redoing a lot of this work is to be able to share more code between implementations, anything that relies on having a reference implementation with a particular calling pattern, webhooks or gRPC or whatever, is going to end up being something that can't be shared if that's not the implementation that some other provider chooses to use. Like the thing I'm working against doesn't have a REST API of any sort right now and lives in the cluster and works on CRDs. So if I would have to build a REST API of some sort in order to integrate with the new version of Cluster API provider, then that's all extra work that I would have to do. Because I wouldn't want to have to re-implement the whole thing or fork it and remove all the webhook calls and replace them with something else. So if there's some way to consider a reference implementation that is not assumed to be based on calling out to some other service, then I think that would go.
I think there's a way to depending upon your requirements, I think there's a way to have your cake and eat it too. The whole system is based upon watches, and watch notification and event hook mechanism is a way for you to get that same signal in cluster that without you having to have yet another CRD. So I think this should be part of the proposals for the extension mechanisms that allow that to take into account that particular use case scenario. But again, it should all be all about user stories, right? So the KEPs that come up, if they're missing a user story, outline the user story. That's the most important aspect, because the implementation details should be based upon the user story, and there might be multiple ways so that we can accomplish that without any solution A or solution B before we even have the user stories all hammered out. So again, KEPs will come into place. They're going to be vetted. We're not just going to merge something without it being vetted. So my key feedback to the group here would be that make sure your user story is in place on the KEPs as they get put up, and that we can address the concerns probably as they start to come in line. But I do agree with David that I think things are a little premature at this point.
And Doug, I do just want to address one comment you made about reference implementations forcing things. We want to split this into what is the preferred chosen extension mechanism or mechanisms, and that's what's important. The reference implementations will just, use whatever the mechanisms are that the community chooses.
Okay, I'm not sure that really alleviates my concern. I mean, I think the point that I was trying to make is if the reference implementation assumes calling out using any kind of mechanism, then how much of that is actually going to be reusable code for anything that doesn't have that calling pattern?
So the reference implementation, I'll give an example here. A possible reference implementation could be a kubeadm-based bootstrapper for setting up your machine. The extension point is I need to get my machine bootstrapped. So there theoretically could be a controller that uses a webhook to call out, or there could be a controller that expects to keep the actuator model that we have today. But the common code is the fact that we need to perform this action of bootstrapping. And so, if Cluster API decides we're going to do webhooks, then the reference implementation will be webhook based. If it decides we're going to support webhooks and CRDs, then it doesn't really matter necessarily what the reference implementation looks like, because if you want to do CRDs, then you can do that, or whatever the chosen mechanism is.
Okay, so the bit that gets swapped out from the reference implementation to be my provider specific implementation would be a whole unit that was somehow triggered to do its operation, whether that be by it knowing what events to watch for, or what changes on what objects to watch for, or whatever. Or is that the idea? I mean, I guess I'm not really clear on what we mean when we say reference implementation. When I hear that, what I think of as like, this is what everybody's going to use, and if you want to do something different, then you have to build that yourself. And maybe that's not what you mean.
No, I think that yesterday we have a conversation that probably was very illustrative with Vince, in that we were basically talking about this issue, and the idea was like, for instance, the cluster controller, when you create a cluster, you need to create a control plane, and you need to follow certain steps. And the idea of this model is that you can register extension provider webhooks for certain actions, but you cannot. I mean, if it's empty, the cluster will not call anyone because there is no webhook registered there. But, and that brings to my initial point, if you handle all these objects as CRDs and you create the object and you have a controller, the controller will take care of that object. If you have a webhook, you take this object and you pass to the webhook. So basically, you are like saying, for this specific action, I have a webhook. But if you don't want to use it, you want to provide your own controller-based implementation of that action. As long as you create this URD, you can reuse that. That was my point, that we should try to use everything as URD, just basically because it covers both cases.
So,
sorry, I just said my point is that probably the reference implementation is like we agree as a community to implement certain actions collectively and say, oh, we will do it at webhook. But for instance, in the Bootstrap case, this is a specific case, there are already implementations in other projects that are based on CRDs. It makes no sense to implement a webhook-based one, and we shouldn't. And we don't have to. If we want, we can do it, but we can also reuse the other one. It's not an either or. It's a lot of flexibility if we follow this simple pattern of creating CRDs and using dynamic registry of webhook for different actions. I think that it can actually work and cover at least these two use cases. There may be another use cases. I remember someone mentioned like library-based extension mechanisms. That's a little bit tricky. I don't know how to handle that.
So to answer your question, Doug, at least in my mind, there are certain aspects of Cluster API that are not swappable. So, there will be logic. For example, the cluster controller for right now will look at your cluster that you've created, and if it's missing a finalizer, it'll add the cluster finalizer to it. I can't imagine anybody really wanting to change that logic. I mean, maybe you do, but presumably that's common logic. So to me, that's not reference implementation. That's common code that everybody's going to use. The swappable aspects are when you get to infrastructure-specific tasks or bootstrapping tasks where you want to use kubeadm or you don't. Those are the things where some of those will have reference implementations, and the goal is to define what are the common parts and then what are the extension points. And the extension points would be things like bootstrapping a cluster, and that's where there may be a reference implementation, and if you don't like it, you could use a different one.
Okay, I think that alleviates some of my concern. If it seems like, and it seems like the direction I want things to go, right? I want to be able to reuse as much code and share as much code as possible between these different systems, and so as long as the way those extensions or whatever are swapped in and out is somehow, like my system, I don't care about webhooks particularly, but if somebody wanted to deploy a cluster building on top of what I've built and also use webhooks to do something extra, then I would want to be able to support that, even if I'm not using them to do my implementation. So if we can accommodate some of that sort of thing where it's not required, but it, like Paulo was just saying, it's extra, then I feel like that's going in the right direction that I'm comfortable with.
All right. I think we've sufficiently covered that topic. Let's go ahead and move on. Daniel, calendar invites.
Yeah, sorry. It's, and on a bureaucratic note, I can maybe bring this up in a different meeting, but I thought I've forgotten about it. Basically, I guess this applies to calendar invites for the whole, you know, for the SIG in general. I think there are at least two ways that I know of that calendar invites get created. One is directly to the calendar, and I think you have to have certain permissions to do that. SIG leads, I think, have those permissions and create those invites. I've also seen people sending invites to the group, and then those invites, at least on my Google Calendar, they appear. Some invites have not appeared. So basically, you know, is there like one correct way that we're supposed to be doing it? And I see that there are kind of trade-offs to each.
So you're supposed to PR the main repo, the main community repo, denoting that you are having a separate meeting. And then from there, have me or Justin, and I need to show Justin how we do this, or Lucas, but Lucas has been busy for a while, how to, or when you want to have it, and we send out the invite as well as set up the Zoom account for you.
Okay, so then, yeah, I guess I need to reach out to you or Justin right now to make an update to the invites, not for time, but just for the content. Because that's one of the drawbacks. If I'm not creating them, then I guess the other thing is for things like these work stream meetings, are though, you know, they're kind of ephemeral. Are they also going? Are they supposed to go to, you know, through the PR process and all of that?
No, they should be posted to YouTube and recorded, but they're supposed to just be ephemeral and collapse. There's no need to PR the community repo on that particular items.
Okay. Thanks.
All right. Any other topics for today?
Should we punt during KubeCon EU, or do folks still want to have the meeting? That's just a general statement. Question.
I would say that we probably want to punt. Is there anybody that objects to that? Nope. Okay, let's cancel it. All right. If that is all, I think we can call it for today. Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Bye. Bye. Have a good day.